Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Altieri Typica wash process Panama from Mood Trap Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Mood Trap, based out of Singapore. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Hacienda La Papaya, a wash processed Ecuadorian coffee. And a lot of you might imagine that that coffee was the catalyst for this purchase, but this is actually the one that I was more interested in, because the only coffee that is more interesting to me than a wash processed Ecuadorian coffee is a non-geisha wash processed Panamanian coffee. And this one also comes from the Altieri estate, which is a producer that I very much enjoy as well. So this release in total was one of the most exciting releases I've seen from a coffee roaster in a very long time. So even though I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of that one, it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 67. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. Interestingly enough, this one did feel just a slight bit lighter than that Hacienda La Papaya, and neither of these were necessarily particularly light coffees. Again, they're nowhere near as light as some of the earlier representations of Mood Trap's coffees that we've had in the past. And again, the only comparison we have based off Singaporean-based coffee roasters is Exposure Therapy, and those coffees are so much lighter than the experience that we had from this one as well. This one's probably a little closer to a true medium light, as it didn't have quite as many of those robust qualities that we experienced from the Hacienda La Papaya. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. On day 40, first impression. So once again, waited the requested day 40 to start this coffee, and we opted for the V60. And the looks of this coffee are a little deceptive, as when I opened the bags of both of those coffees, I took a look at the beans of both of them, inspected the beans of both of them, and this one just visually looked a little bit more developed, but it was actually that Hacienda La Papaya that performed a little bit more developed, as it is turning out a little bit lighter than the visuals would indicate, and there was even a very slight peanut feel to it. Otherwise, it's classically Panamanian with a strong sugary sweetness to go with a light floral jasmine and honeysuckle, so it was actually a pretty enjoyable first impression. Interestingly enough, if I would have had this coffee as the Mejorado, I would have said it is quite reminiscent of a Mejorado in a number of ways, primarily in that sugary sense. So I enjoyed this first impression, but at the same time, washed Panamanian non-geisha coffees are actually some of my favorite coffees out there in existence. They're easily some of my favorite coffees to review as well. Day 43 through the Chemex, and the coffee is a little less impressive today, as it felt a little less descript. Sweetness and intensity both felt relatively toned down, with a softer citric quality and a more generic floral feel. Traces of vanilla sweetness, but generally a more tame experience this time around, so not necessarily performing as well through this brew method. But we will go ahead and move on to day 46, as we opted for the UFO brewer. And the coffee is better today, as it has been a little inconsistent. This felt like a combination between the first two experiences that we did have, as it was a little bit better than the Chemex day, but not quite as good as the B60 day. There's a little bit more of that sugary florality and a little bit more of a palm fruit quality in terms of the brightness. Additionally, some honey qualities with a not particularly intense intensity behind it. They're all presented in a little bit more subtle of a sense as well. So just, I would say, still better than that Chemex day, not necessarily to the extent that we were hoping for though. And one thing that's worth noting, Mood Trap didn't include any sort of notes on either of their two most recent releases, so I don't know what Mood Trap's notes were for this coffee or even that Hacienda La Papaya. Just wanted to notate that real quick, but we'll go ahead and move on to day 49, as we opted for the V60 with Mood Trap's ratio once again. So they only have a ratio at a 16.67 to 1. Same thing with this coffee, we decided to push it and go a little lower on the extraction. This day we went higher on the temperatures, 99 Celsius, and the coffee was a bit more generic today with less definition to the previously prominent vanilla-like characteristic. Most abundant quality is a malic brightness and a generic citric feel with a slightly textured tea-like sense to it as well. So, okay, once again, not necessarily my favorites. We'll go ahead and move on to day 52, as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and there's a similar sentiment, as it's unknown whether the higher extraction adjustments have hindered this coffee or if it's just aging out a bit, which would be kind of an interesting dynamic. A little bit more generic today with a slightly higher texture and brightness to it. Slight honey and vanilla as well, but for the most part, it's not overly descriptive. And I keep using the word slight largely because nothing here was particularly intense on this day either. Day 55 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, and the coffee continues to remain pretty nondescript as it offers a generic roasted tea feel to it. That's kind of interesting to me because obviously I was brewing these two coffees side by side, and it's funny to me that I got a lot of similar characteristics from both of these two coffees. I kind of wonder what to make of that. But outside of that, intensity was a little bit more toned down as well, so not necessarily the best on this day either. On day 58 through the Chemex with the same adjustments. And it's back to being one of the better days of this coffee as it's offering more characteristics reminiscent of our initial experience, so florality in the vanilla, jasmine, honeysuckle-like scents, cleaner and more sweet with a slight citric quality to it as well. But honestly, the best impression that I had of this coffee was the first impression, so we went back to our standard recipe that we brewed with initially on day 62 V60 with that recipe, and it's on the better side again as it does continue to remain reminiscent of our initial experiences with the classic Central American profile. Focus on the florality and citrus with a slight green apple brightness and tartness and some notable honeyed qualities to it as well. So this coffee towards the end, I would say, was pretty nice in general. Kind of a lot of what I was expecting for this coffee going into it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. Kind of an interesting looking tasting wheel, but let's go through it. Quite a few level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. This is much closer of a level 4 than the Hacienda La Papaya coffee was. There's better definitions to this coffee, even if once again they aren't necessarily the most well-defined or intense. But I do have to say that when we were able to get this coffee at its best, which was the first and last day that we brewed it, it was pretty nice, pretty well defined. So level 4s work pretty well for this one. Finish level 4. Towards the earlier days, I was getting a little bit more of that sugary vanilla finish to it, which is something that I oftentimes get when it comes to washed Panamanian non-Gesher coffees. Even Geshas at times can have that, but it was pretty nice, and there are a lot of those citric qualities to it. I'm thinking both the generic citrus as well as that apple-like characteristic, which was presented within the finish. So all of those things do make an ever-changing level 4 for the finish, even if it's also not necessarily the most intense. Sweetness level 4. Same thing as with the Hacienda La Papaya. There were days where it probably wasn't reaching that level 4 mark, but this one didn't have as much deviation throughout the entirety. It was always at least at the level 3, if verging on the level 4 mark, but the best I was able to get from this coffee was also a level 4, and this is much more of a true level 4 than Hacienda La Papaya was. A little less generous with this tasting wheel than I was with that one. Florality level 4, I mentioned the honeysuckle, jasmine, and most specifically that vanilla characteristic to this one. So level 4, where we opted to put that, easily my favorite part of this coffee to go alongside the sweetness when I was able to get both of those from it. Citrus fruit level 4, mentioned a little bit of that generic citric quality. That green apple tartness is also presented with in this one. So in a way, it reminds me of some Mejorado coffees that I've had in the past, if maybe not necessarily as intense and sweet as those were. A couple of level 3s, we'll start with the acidity level 3. Not the brightest coffee, did not expect this one to necessarily be, I would say, the vast majority of Typica Panamanian coffees that I do have usually end up at that 3 mark anyway. Stone fruit level 3, able to get some very slight stone fruit characteristics to it, but nothing that was overly well defined or pronounced to it either. Chocolate level 3, as I was kind of thinking about that, I said this coffee has that specific classic Central American characteristic to it, so we decided to bump that up all the way to the level 3 mark. Final thing worth discussing, body level 3. Plenty of texture to this one. That's a little bit more justified with this coffee given that it is brewed through the V60, and in general it is a Typica, so it's not going to be as light bodied as your Panamanian Geshers would be. Outside of that though, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It's still not necessarily there. I saw glimpses of this one being very nice the first time and last time I did brew it, but it wasn't particularly consistent and it wasn't quite as good as a lot of the experiences that we've had from Mood Trap in the past. But in comparison to the Hacienda La Papaya and the Arbogona, I think that this one was significantly better than those. But I'm yet to come across many washed Panamanian non-geisha coffees that I haven't enjoyed, and I think that this one, being as in line with my own preferences, probably really helped it out. I thought that there were a lot of really enjoyable things to be found within this coffee. It just wasn't necessarily the easiest to work with. It seemed like we just kind of went around in a big circle where if you push this coffee, it doesn't turn out the best. If you go lower on the extraction, it doesn't turn out the best. And you just kind of have to leave it in that more neutral ground to find something that still feels like it has much more potential than it ended up having anyway. So it's nice for what it is, but at the same time, this coffee, in theory, should be one of the more enjoyable coffees that I've had this year in general. It just maybe didn't live up to the expectations that I had for it going into it. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Interestingly enough, at the time of recording, it's still available for purchase, which is something that I don't think a lot of people would have expected from Mood Trap a couple of years ago, but it does offer the nice combination of what you would expect for a non-geisha washed Panamanian coffee. So it's clean, it's sweet, it has some pretty defined characteristics at times, plenty of body and texture to it as well, and not necessarily the brightest. So definitely plenty of enjoyable things, kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're into content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Altieri Estate Typica, wash processed Panama from Mood Trap Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.